Hi, my name is Emily Carter, and I'm 24 years old. Before we start the story, I just want to ask you something. Drop a comment and tell me which country you're watching this from. I really want to know where my viewers are connecting from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional and suspenseful documentaries like this. Now, let's begin. I was never the kind of person my family was proud of. From the very beginning, I always felt like I was standing slightly outside the circle, watching everyone else belong somewhere I didn't. At family gatherings, I would sit quietly in the corner while my cousins were introduced with pride, their achievements spoken about like trophies. One was becoming a doctor, another had already started a business, and another was studying abroad. Every conversation seemed to highlight how successful everyone else was, and somehow I always ended up as the example of what not to be. It wasn't always direct insults at first, but small comments that slowly built up over time, like cracks forming in glass. "He is still figuring things out," they would say, followed by a laugh that felt heavier than words. Or sometimes, "Some people just take longer, maybe forever." Disclaimer: this story is purely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, events, or situations is purely coincidental. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that family love would eventually overcome judgment, that time would prove my worth. But the more I stayed in that environment, the more I realized that they weren't waiting for me to succeed. They were expecting me to fail. Even my own relatives began to treat my presence as something temporary, like I didn't quite fit into the future they imagined for themselves. When discussions about success came up, my name was never included. When advice was given, it was always directed at others. I became invisible even when I was physically present. The worst part wasn't just what they said in front of me, but what they said when I wasn't around. I would overhear conversations through half-open doors or sat in silence when I entered a room. "He doesn't have direction," one uncle said once. "He should just accept a simple job and stop dreaming too big," another added. My parents never defended me strongly. They would simply lower their eyes and say nothing, as if silence was easier than disagreement. That silence hurt more than any insult because it felt like quiet acceptance. I remember one particular evening clearly. It was a family dinner, and everyone was talking about future plans, investments, and education. My cousin had just received praise for securing a scholarship abroad. Everyone clapped and congratulated him. Then someone turned to me and asked, almost jokingly, "What about you? What are your plans?" I froze for a moment, trying to find the right words. Before I could even answer properly, someone else interrupted with a laugh and said, "Let him relax. He still has time to figure out what job suits him." Everyone laughed. Even I smiled slightly, not because it was funny, but because I didn't know how else to react. After that night, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger at first. It was something quieter, deeper, and more dangerous. It was realization. I realized that no matter what I said or did, their perception of me had already been decided. I was no longer being judged based on my future potential, but on a label they had already assigned to me: failure. And once people assign you that label, they stop looking at your effort and only wait for confirmation of what they believe. That was the moment I stopped trying to prove myself to them. I stopped explaining my ideas. I stopped sharing my thoughts. Even when I had dreams or plans, I kept them to myself. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I understood that sharing them would only invite more laughter or doubt. Instead, I started observing. I began listening more carefully to conversations, not emotionally, but analytically. I studied how they treated success, how they respected money, how they valued status above everything else. I began to see patterns in their behavior, especially how quickly they dismissed anything that didn't come with immediate proof of success. Over time, I started feeling less like a family member and more like an outsider studying a group I didn't belong to. That distance gave me clarity. While they focused on appearances and comparisons, I started focusing on escape. I would sit alone at night, thinking about how small their world seemed, how limited their thinking was, and how easily they decided someone's worth based on temporary circumstances. That realization didn't just hurt me, it motivated me. Because if their judgment was so shallow, then their definition of failure meant nothing in the long run. Eventually, I stopped responding to their comments entirely. When they mocked me, I stayed silent. When they ignored me, I didn't seek attention. That silence confused them at first. But soon they accepted it as part of who I was. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't broken or defeated. I was simply shifting my focus away from them and towards something they couldn't see. Something they wouldn't understand until it was too late. Leaving home was not dramatic or emotional in the way people often imagine. There were no final speeches, no tears at the doorstep, no one trying to stop me. It was quieter than that. Almost invisible. I packed my things in a small bag because I didn't have much to carry, and because I didn't want to give anyone a reason to ask questions. My family assumed I was just going out to try my luck again, like I had done before. They didn't take it seriously, and that was fine with me. In fact, their indifference made it easier to leave without hesitation. The city I moved to was nothing like home. It was loud, fast, and completely indifferent to who I was or what I had left behind. No one cared about my story, my past, or the way I had been treated. That was both terrifying and freeing at the same time. For the first time, I wasn't living under labels given by people who knew me. I was just another face in a crowd of thousands trying to survive each day. I had no connections, no support system, and no clear direction. All I had was time and the willingness to endure whatever came next. My first days were the hardest. I slept in cheap shared rooms where the walls were thin and privacy didn't exist. I worked wherever I could find something. Sometimes as a delivery rider riding through heavy traffic under harsh sun, sometimes as a cleaner in buildings where people walked past me without even acknowledging my presence, and sometimes lifting heavy boxes in warehouses where the hours felt endless. My body hurt constantly, and there were moments when exhaustion made me question whether I had made a mistake by leaving at all. But every time that thought came, I remembered the laughter from my family, the comments that told me I would never become anything. And that memory pushed me forward again. There was a strange pattern I noticed in my life during those early months. The more invisible I became to others, the more aware I became of myself. I started observing everything around me carefully. I noticed how successful people behaved, how money moved through systems, how small opportunities often went unnoticed by those who were too focused on complaining about their situation. While others at my level spent their free time resting or escaping reality, I spent mine learning. I would sit with my phone after long shifts and watch videos about business, investment, digital markets, and how companies grow from nothing into powerful structures. At first, I didn't fully understand most of it, but I kept watching anyway. Slowly, something began to change in my thinking. I stopped seeing my situation as permanent. I started seeing it as a phase, a starting point rather than an ending. Even though I had nothing, I realized that I still had access to information, and information could eventually become power if used correctly. I began to study patterns in online markets, small trading systems, and digital platforms where people were quietly building income streams without needing traditional jobs. Every night after work, instead of sleeping immediately, I would spend hours learning and planning, even if I was too tired to fully process everything. The turning point came when I tried my first small online deal. It wasn't anything big or impressive. It was a simple transaction that involved connecting two people and taking a small margin. But when it worked, something inside me clicked. It wasn't about the money. It was about the realization that I could create value without physical strength or constant labor. That small success gave me confidence, and more importantly, curiosity. I wanted to understand how far this could go. After that, I started experimenting more carefully. I made mistakes, lost small amounts, learned from each failure, and adjusted my approach. I treated every success and failure as data rather than emotion. Over time, my understanding grew, and so did my results. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my coworkers, not my family, not anyone from my past life. I wanted complete separation between the person I was becoming and the person they still believed I was. As my small earnings grew into something more stable, I reinvested everything. I avoided unnecessary spending, lived below my means, and focused entirely on scaling. I studied how online systems could be automated, how networks could be expanded, and how influence could be built without visibility. Eventually, I started creating multiple streams quietly, none of them linked directly to my identity. On paper, I remained insignificant. In reality, things were beginning to change in ways no one around me could imagine. Even then, I never forgot where I came from. I still remembered every word spoken about me, every moment of doubt, every laugh that came at my expense. But I didn't let those memories control my emotions anymore. Instead, they became fuel for discipline. While others celebrated small comfort, I was building something that required patience, secrecy, and long-term vision. I understood that real change doesn't happen loudly. It happens silently, in moments where no one is watching. And that understanding shaped everything I did from that point onward. Years had passed since I left my old life behind, and by that time, I was no longer the struggling person who had arrived in the city with nothing but a small bag and a quiet mindset. I had built something far more structured, something that existed behind layers of anonymity and careful planning. On the surface, my life still looked simple. I did not live in luxury, I did not draw attention, and I avoided anything that could connect my present identity to my growing success. But behind that silence, I had become deeply involved in systems that generated consistent income. Small at first, then gradually expanding into multiple streams that required discipline more than visibility. What made everything different now was not just the money, but the control I had over how it moved. I learned how to operate without being seen, how to build structures that functioned independently of recognition, and how to use distance as protection. While others chased attention, I avoided it completely. While others posted their progress, I hid mine. It was not fear anymore. It was strategy. I understood that the moment people know what you have, they also begin to influence how you lose it. During this period, I occasionally checked on my family from a distance. Not emotionally, but observationally. Their situation had changed significantly, and not in a positive way. The same people who once laughed at me were now struggling with problems they had never prepared for. Businesses that once supported their lifestyle began collapsing due to poor decisions and changing circumstances. Debt started accumulating quietly at first, then aggressively. The comfort they once took for granted slowly turned into pressure, and that pressure became visible in their behavior. My uncle, who used to speak with confidence about success and failure, had lost his primary source of income. My aunt's household was facing financial strain, and the stability they once showed in public was slowly breaking down behind closed doors. Even my cousins, who once acted superior, were now dealing with uncertainty in their careers. The same family that once laughed collectively at my absence was now collectively trying to survive challenges they never thought they would face. At first, I watched without involvement. I told myself that distance was necessary, that I should not interfere with the lives of people who never believed in me. But over time, something shifted. It was not sympathy, and it was not forgiveness. It was awareness. I realized that their downfall was not caused by a single event, but by a lack of structure, lack of planning, and dependence on unstable systems. They were not being punished by fate. They were simply experiencing the consequences of their own decisions. That realization created a conflict inside me. On one hand, I had every reason to stay away and let them face their situation alone. On the other hand, I had the resources and ability to intervene without revealing myself. I began to think in a more calculated way. If I helped them openly, it would break the distance I had built and bring unnecessary emotional complications. But if I helped them secretly, I could maintain control over my identity, while still influencing outcomes. That is when the first decision happened quietly. One of their financial emergencies reached a point where immediate support was required, or they would lose something important. Instead of stepping forward, I used an external account connected to a business entity that had no visible link to me. The payment was processed anonymously, structured in a way that made it appear as if it came from an unrelated source. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't expect gratitude. I simply observed the result. The reaction on their side was predictable. They were confused but relieved. They called it luck. Some even referred to it as divine intervention. That response revealed something important about them. They were quick to accept help but never quick to question its origin. That made future actions easier to manage. After that first intervention, similar situations kept appearing. A hospital bill that threatened to overwhelm them was cleared without explanation. A pending rent issue was resolved before eviction notices could escalate. A debt restructuring they believed was impossible suddenly became manageable because someone had paid off a significant portion without revealing themselves. Each time, the outcome was the same: gratitude without understanding, relief without awareness. What they did not know was that each of these actions was carefully calculated. I did not intervene emotionally. I analyzed each situation like a system failure and applied a solution that required minimal exposure. I made sure no pattern could be traced, no connection established between the different forms of assistance. To them, it appeared random. To me, it was controlled precision. As time continued, their financial instability grew more complex, but so did my ability to manage it indirectly. I expanded my reach through different companies and intermediaries, ensuring that no single point of contact could reveal the source. I learned how to move resources without visibility, how to stabilize situations without recognition, and how to influence outcomes while remaining completely absent from the narrative. Despite all of this, I never interacted with them directly. I avoided conversations, avoided contact, and avoided any situation that could expose my involvement. My identity remained separate from their reality. In their eyes, I was still the same person they had dismissed years ago, someone irrelevant to their present life. That belief allowed everything I did to remain hidden. But internally, something was shifting. The more I helped them, the more I realized that my actions were not driven by forgiveness alone. There was structure in my decisions, but also something deeper that I was not fully acknowledging yet. I was not just saving them. I was positioning myself in a way that ensured that if the truth ever came out, it would reshape everything they believed about success, failure, and the person they had once ignored completely. The situation began to change when one of my carefully separated business divisions expanded faster than expected. I had built multiple layers of operations to ensure that no single point could ever be traced back to me, but growth has a way of creating noise even when you try to keep everything silent. One of my internal companies had opened a new department to handle analytics and compliance for large-scale transactions. It was meant to be a routine expansion, nothing that would attract attention. But sometimes, even routine systems become the reason hidden things start surfacing. My cousin joined that department without knowing anything about my involvement. To him, it was just another job opportunity in a competitive market. He had no idea that the entire structure of the company he was working for was part of something far larger than what was visible on the surface. When he got hired, I didn't intervene. I didn't block it or guide it. I allowed it to happen because, at that point, I was confident that even if someone from my past entered my world, they would never be able to connect the dots. For a while, everything remained normal. He worked like any other employee, unaware of the hidden architecture around him. He never suspected that the silent investor behind multiple projects in the system was the same person his family once mocked. In fact, he often spoke about his personal life during casual office conversations. He would mention family struggles, financial pressure, and occasionally even complain about how people in his hometown had no ambition. The irony was sharp, but I kept my distance and never reacted. However, systems built at scale always leave traces, no matter how carefully they are designed. A minor accounting discrepancy triggered an internal audit request. It was not serious at first, just a routine verification of transaction flows. But in complex systems, even small errors can open deeper layers if someone is persistent enough. My cousin, being naturally curious and slightly ambitious, decided to review some of the internal financial logs assigned to his department. That decision changed everything. While analyzing data, he came across a pattern of repeated transactions linked to multiple subsidiaries. At first, it looked like standard corporate movement between entities. But something about the structure felt unusual. The timing, the repetition, and the coded identifiers did not match typical business behavior. He followed the trail further, thinking it might lead to a fraud case or internal mismanagement. What he didn't realize was that he was slowly stepping into a system designed specifically to hide itself from people exactly like him. As he dug deeper, he began noticing encrypted references embedded within transaction logs. These were not obvious to most employees, but someone with enough access and curiosity could trace them across different layers. One of those identifiers matched a project code that connected indirectly to a financial relief program that had previously supported his own family during a crisis. At that moment, confusion replaced curiosity. He started linking unrelated events together without understanding the full structure behind them. The more he investigated, the more unstable the pattern became in his mind. He discovered that multiple emergency payments, debt settlements, and financial interventions affecting his family over the years were somehow connected to entities under the same hidden network. What he thought were random acts of fortune suddenly appeared structured, intentional, and disturbingly precise. It didn't make sense to him that all these events could be coincidence. Eventually, he bypassed a restricted layer in the system, using credentials he should not have used. That action triggered internal alerts, but by then, it was already too late. He had accessed a high-level summary log that consolidated key financial flows across multiple divisions. That document contained a coded signature used internally for verification across systems. It was not meant for general employees, and certainly not for someone in his position. But he recognized it instantly. Not because he understood it, but because he had seen something similar before in a completely different context, tied to his own family's financial relief records. That was the moment everything collapsed into realization for him. He traced the signature across multiple entries, and every path eventually led to one centralized origin point that had been intentionally masked through layers of corporate separation. When he finally decoded the structure, the result was impossible for him to process emotionally. The identity behind the system he had been investigating was not a stranger, not a faceless corporation, but someone from his own past, someone his family had dismissed completely years ago. He came to my office the next morning, not as a confident employee, but as someone visibly shaken, struggling to understand what he had discovered. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood there for a moment, trying to stabilize his thoughts. The atmosphere between us was different from anything we had ever shared before. He finally broke the silence with a question that carried both disbelief and fear, asking why everything he had seen seemed to point back to me, and why someone like me would be connected to so many things that had silently supported his own family without their knowledge. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence sit between us long enough for the weight of his discovery to settle. In that moment, I realized that the distance I had maintained for years was no longer enough to keep reality hidden. He already knew too much, but not enough to understand the full structure. The truth was no longer a distant possibility. It had entered the same physical space where we were standing, and everything that followed from that point could no longer remain the same. The message went out quietly, the same way everything in my life had been built to operate. No public announcement, no dramatic exposure, no emotional buildup for outsiders. Just a simple internal notice sent through a controlled channel. A family meeting was requested, and attendance was mandatory. For them, it must have felt unusual, even suspicious. I had not been in regular contact for years, and suddenly, I was calling them all together without explanation. That alone would have been enough to create tension. They arrived one by one, uncertain and uncomfortable. The atmosphere in the room felt heavier than normal family gatherings. There was no warmth, no casual conversation, no attempt at pretending everything was fine. They looked around as if searching for answers in the walls, not yet realizing that the answers were already in the room with them. I remained silent for a few moments after they entered, allowing their confusion to grow naturally. I didn't want control through force. I wanted control through realization. When I finally began speaking, my voice was calm, almost detached. I didn't introduce emotion into the moment, because emotion would have reduced the clarity of what needed to be understood. I started by presenting facts, one layer at a time. The companies I had built, the structures I created, the systems operating behind the scenes, all slowly revealed in a way that connected pieces they had never known existed. Their initial reaction was disbelief. They looked at each other, expecting someone to laugh or interrupt and say it was a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. As I continued, I showed them evidence, not just claims but structured proof. Financial flows, ownership patterns, internal records that connected multiple events they had experienced over the years. Each document I revealed tied directly to situations they had once believed were random blessings or unexplained reliefs. I watched their expressions shift slowly, from confusion to shock, and then to something heavier, something closer to realization. They were not ready for. I explained how every major financial crisis they had faced in recent years had been silently stabilized. The unpaid debts that suddenly disappeared, the emergency hospital bills that were covered without explanation, the properties they had been able to keep despite financial pressure, all of it was not coincidence. It was structured intervention, and it all traced back to one source: me. The room became silent in a way that felt almost unnatural. No one spoke, not even in whispers. The idea that the same person they had dismissed for years had been operating behind their survival created a contradiction in their minds that they struggled to process. My uncle tried to speak but stopped halfway, unable to form words that made sense of the situation. My mother looked down, her hand shaking slightly, as if she was trying to hold on to a version of reality that was now collapsing in front of her. I didn't stop there. I continued explaining not just what I had done, but why I had done it the way I did. I told them that visibility would have destroyed the purpose. If I had revealed myself earlier, the same pride that once allowed them to mock me would have interfered with every decision. They would have either rejected help out of ego or manipulated the situation for sympathy. So I chose silence instead. I chose structure over recognition. Then I showed them something else. A record of every insult, every dismissive comment, every moment where they had defined my worth as nothing. I didn't show it to provoke anger. I showed it to establish context, because understanding the past was necessary to understand the present. I reminded them that while they were building confidence by belittling me, I was building systems and silence that eventually reached back into their lives without them ever noticing. One of my cousins finally spoke, his voice unstable, asking why I would help people who never believed in me. It wasn't an easy question for him, and I could see he was struggling to separate emotion from logic. I paused for a moment before answering. I told them that it was never about helping or revenge in the way they might assume. It was about observation. I wanted to see what kind of people they would become when they were no longer comfortable, when the systems they depended on began to fail, and when the person they dismissed became the only reason they remained stable. Then I made the final decision that shifted everything. I explained that I would not be punishing them, nor continuing in secrecy forever. Instead, I transferred control of everything I had built into a structured trust system. But access to it would not be automatic. It would depend on their ability to rebuild themselves, not financially alone, but ethically, responsibly, and with awareness of how easily judgment can destroy relationships. They would have to learn what they had never understood before. Stability is not something that exists without effort or respect. After explaining this, I didn't wait for reactions. There was no need to witness their breakdown or acceptance in real time. I had already seen enough through their silence, their expressions, and their inability to respond. The purpose of the meeting was not emotional closure, it was revelation. I stood up, leaving the documents behind, leaving the system in place, and leaving the room the same way I had once left everything behind years ago, but this time without uncertainty or hesitation. And that's where everything finally comes full circle. What started as humiliation, silence, and being called worthless turned into a truth no one saw coming. Sometimes success is not loud. It doesn't need attention, validation, or applause. It builds in silence. It grows in patience, and when it finally reveals itself, It changes everything in a single moment. If this story made you think, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in his place? Until the next story.